Okay, we've been looking at a number of parables which have been really showing us about the kingdom of God and what it means to be in that kingdom. And we continue along with that theme this evening in Luke chapter 14. And we're going to look at a couple of parables here, but we want to look at the context of this chapter to begin with. And we find the context in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6, which sets the scene for the telling of the two parables that we be looking at this evening. So Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6, Luke records this. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler who belonged to the Pharisees, they were watching him, and behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they were silent. Then he took him and healed him and let him go. And he said to them, Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well, will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day? And they could not reply to this. So Luke records here an occasion when Jesus went to dine with a Pharisee, and he's recording some of the incidents and the conversations that took place around the meal table, including the two parables spoken by Jesus. It was a Sabbath day when Jesus was invited to dine at the house of a ruler who belonged to the Pharisees. The man who had invited Jesus to eat with him was an important man. He's described as a ruler. Doesn't tell us what sort of ruler he was, whether perhaps he had some sort of official leadership role in the synagogue or something like that, perhaps. This is not the first time that Jesus has been invited to eat in the home of a Pharisee. Earlier in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 7 and verse 36, we have another occasion here when he's invited by a Pharisee. Luke 7:36 says, One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and took his place at table. And it's on this occasion when this woman, who's described as a woman of the city, who's a sinner, she comes in with her ointment, and she washes Jesus' feet with her tears and anoints him with her ointment. So that's one occasion when Jesus ate with the invited to the home of a Pharisee. Another one is in Luke chapter 11 and verse 37, which begins, While he was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. So again, another occasion there where this time it's been observed that Jesus didn't undergo the ceremonial washing before eating, and the Pharisee notes that. We perhaps familiar with Jesus eating with the tax collectors, but Jesus was willing to accept invitations from all sorts of people, and he used these occasions as opportunities to teach people. As we see here in Luke chapter 14, there were others present who had been invited to this meal who were watching Jesus or observing him closely. They're looking for some sort of charge or accusation that they might make against Jesus, that he's somehow breaking the rules or breaking the law. We see them doing this in Luke chapter 6 and verse 7 in the synagogue as well, where on a Sabbath day, Jesus goes into the synagogue and there's a man there who has a withered hand. And we're told that the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might find an accusation against him. And this seems to be what's going on here in Luke chapter 14 as well, that there are people present who are looking for an opportunity to bring some sort of accusation against Jesus, because present at this meal table as well is a man who we're told had dropsy, and that's an incurable condition in which water was retained in the limbs of the body, the arms and legs, so that which would cause them to swell up. Whether the man's been placed there deliberately to see what Jesus would do, we don't know, but he is present and they're watching him. So Jesus preempts anything that might be said by those present at the meal, and he asks the lawyers and the Pharisees, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? So he's putting the ball back in their court. And it should have been an easy question for these experts in the law to answer, but they didn't. They kept quiet. They had nothing to say. So Jesus answered his own question then by taking the man and healing him and then letting him go. And Jesus defended his action by asking, which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well, will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day? Jesus suggests that it is right to show mercy, to do acts of mercy and concern on the Sabbath day if someone or some animal is in trouble or difficulty. The Sabbath laws do not prevent this type of merciful action. The Sabbath was given as a benefit to man, a blessing to man, and it was not something that was to be a burden to him. But once again, the lawyers and the Pharisees had nothing to say to this, as we're told in verse 6. So we come on then to the parable that Jesus now tells in verses 7 to 11. So verse 7 to 11 says this, he told a parable to those invited when he noted they chose for themselves the place of honor. He said to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding, do not recline in the place of honor, lest someone more honored than you might have been invited. So that when that person arrives, the one who asked both of you says to you, give this person your place. And then, with shame, you would begin to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and recline in the lowest place, so that when the one who invited you comes, he might say, friend, move up higher. Then you will have glory before all those reclining with you. For all those exalting themselves will be humbled, and those humbling themselves will be lifted up. Jesus' action in healing this man with dropsy on a Sabbath day may have created an atmosphere of hostility or perhaps at least tension within the room amongst the guests. And whilst waiting for the meal to begin, Jesus has observed how those who had been invited to the Pharisees' home sought out the places of honor around the table. They had been there observing Jesus, but Jesus has also been observing them and noting how they have been trying to get into the places of honor. Later in Luke chapter 20 and verse 46, we see James and John wanting to occupy those. Not James and John here. This is again the Pharisees here that Jesus is talking about. He says, beware of the scribes who like to go about in long robes and love salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts. So this was a characteristic of the Pharisees and the scribes, that they wanted to occupy those places of honor at feasts. And Jesus has seen how they were doing that here. So those who thought themselves important and entitled would seek to occupy the best places, the best seats at the table. So this then gave Jesus the opportunity to tell this parable, to teach them a lesson about humility. The room used for the meal would be set up with a low U-shaped table around which were arranged low couches on which the guests would recline. They didn't sit at a table and chairs, a dining table and chairs as we might today, but reclined around a low table. As you can see from the picture there, the person's head would be closest to the table and their feet stretched away from it. The place of honor would be at the base of this U-shaped table, the head of the table, and the second and third most important places were on the right and the left of that central place. Again, this was what James and John were seeking for themselves, as Mark chapter 10, verse 35, 37 tells us that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him, to Jesus, and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. James and John wanted those two seats of honor to the right hand and to the left hand of Jesus in his glory there. So the places that were further away from that central place were the least important. And Jesus had noticed how the guests had been scrambling around to get into those most honored places. This is really an unusual parable. It is called a parable in verse 7. Luke says, Now he told a parable to those who were invited. But it's not really what we think of as a story parable, because here Jesus is addressing the guests directly and he's telling them how they ought to behave rather than telling a story and then allowing them to make the application for themselves. So he tells them about how they should react when they are invited along to a feast. The giving and receiving of invitations were important indicators of a person's social status. Who was invited and where they sat, these were all important considerations. And there were strict rules about who could sit where. So Jesus tells these guests that when they are invited to a marriage feast, they should not seek to sit in the places of honor in case someone more important than them comes in. If this happens, then the host will come to you and ask you to leave the seat and give it to the more important guest. And you then have to do the walk of shame to the lowest seat, since by then this would probably be the only place that is left vacant. This piece of advice is also given in the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 25, verses 6 and 7, which says, Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great, for it is better to be told, Come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of the prince. So instead, Jesus says that when they enter the feast, they should go and occupy the lowest seat. And then when the host comes in, perhaps he will invite you to go up higher. And so you will then be honored in the presence of all those who are at table. Jesus is not teaching a lesson on table manners or etiquette here, or how to manipulate a situation so that you get the best seat. Rather, he's using this picture to illustrate an important principle, which he indicates in verse 11. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That's a principle we find a number of times in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 4, after Jesus has invited the children to come to him. Unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven, he says. Whoever humbles himself like this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then in Matthew chapter 23, verses 11 and 12. He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And then in the letter of James, in James chapter 4, James chapter 4, verse 6, but he gives more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And then in verse 10 as well, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. And Peter in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. Likewise, you that are younger, be subject to the elders, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So that principle, as we see many other times there as well. Jesus is not saying, telling people to occupy the lowest place with the expectation of being invited to go up to a more honored place. He's not advocating a false humility in order to secure some sort of advantage. Rather, it is those who show genuine humility who will be invited to go up higher, those who are really expecting nothing. So an attitude of humility will mean that we don't think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. It will mean that we consider others to be better than ourselves. Humility means we do not have exaggerated ideas of our own importance. It means we claim no right of honor. And this is, as Jesus indicates, how we are to behave in the kingdom. This is how things are to be conducted in the kingdom of God. Jesus then continues with a word for the man who had invited him in verse 12 to verse 14 of Luke 14 again. He also said to the one who had invited him, when you give a midday or evening meal, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, lest you be invited in return and are repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, those who have been injured, those who can't walk, those who can't see, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus tells this man then that when he gives a dinner, and the word he uses here is like a midday meal, or when he gives a banquet, the word there means an evening meal, he should not invite his friends, brothers, his relatives, or his rich neighbors, because they may give him a return invitation, and then he will have been repaid. It's a bit like today when people invite family members along for Christmas. Well, we've had you this year. It's your turn to have us next year. There's no real generosity in giving to those who can repay the honour. Instead of giving invitations to enhance his own position or his status, Jesus says he should invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind, those who cannot repay him, those who cannot show hospitality. And this would be a true act of generosity from which genuine pleasure will be derived. And if he does this, Jesus says he will be blessed and repaid at the resurrection of the just. So there's a reward for this sort of behavior in the resurrection at the end time. Jesus teaches us here that our actions are not to be motivated by a desire for repayment or seeking personal advantage in some way. We should not give thinking, well, what's in it for me? Or how is this going to enhance my position? Like inviting some important people along for a meal and thinking, well, what advantage can I get from them by inviting them? Rather, we are to do good to others with no expectation of any kind of repayment or reward. And this will be a true act of generosity, the true expression of honor, of honoring others. And the reward, the ultimate reward, will come on that day of resurrection. So through this parable, Jesus continues to show how the kingdom of God turns conventions upside down. We do not seek honor for ourselves, and we do not seek repayment for the honor that we have shown to others. Okay, we'll move on here to look at the next parable in the chapter, which Jesus continues on here, continuing to address those at this meal in verses 15 to 24. One of those reclining with him heard this and said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." He said to him, "A certain person gave a great feast, and he invited many people. And he sent his slave at the hour of the feast to say to those invited, 'Come, it is ready now.' But they all began, one after the other, to make excuses. The first one said to him, 'I have bought a field, and I need to go out to see it. I ask you, consider me excused.' Another one said, 'I have bought 5 pairs of oxen, and I must go out to assess them. I ask you, consider me excused.' And another said, 'I have married a wife, and because of this I cannot come.' So the slave went back and reported these things to his lord. Then the master of the house was furious and said to his slave, 'Go out quickly into the wide streets and the narrow alleyways of the city, and bring in the poor, those who have been injured, those who can't see, and those who can't walk.' And the slave said, 'Lord, what you have ordered has happened, and there is still room.' And the Lord said to the slave, 'Go out into the roads and hedgeways and force them to come, so that my house might be full. I say to you that not one of those men who were invited will taste my feast.' But one of the guests at table had been impressed by Jesus' words about the resurrection of the just, and he came out with this exclamation, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God," perhaps reflecting his own desire to be one of those who would be eating bread in the kingdom. Jesus responded with this parable of a great banquet, to which a man invited many guests in order to show a person how a person could come into the kingdom of God. According to custom, the invitations would have been sent out in advance, giving the day of the feast, but not necessarily stating the precise time. And those who were invited would have accepted the invitation at that point. When the day of the banquet came, the man then sent his servant to inform the invited guests that everything was ready, and now was the time for them to come to the banquet. So they've already, it's not as if they're being invited on that day itself, but they would have been invited some time beforehand and would have accepted that invitation. And then on the day itself, they're told, now's the time, it's ready, you need to come. However, all of those who had been invited then started to make their excuses as to why they could not now come. One asked to be excused because he said he'd bought a field and he needed to go and see it. It's a bit of a feeble excuse, since no one would really buy a field without first seeing it, or if there was a need to go and see it, well, that was something that could wait until after the banquet, because the field isn't going to go anywhere. So the excuse is given simply because he didn't want to go. And then another asked to be excused because he had bought 5 yoke or 5 pairs of oxen and he needed to go and examine them. Again, that's not something he needed to do immediately. He could have waited till after the banquet before doing that task as well. And then another said that he couldn't come because he'd just married a wife, and the wife would not have been included in the invitation. This may seem to be a more plausible excuse, especially in the light of Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5, which sort of says that a newly married man is excused from sort of civil duties. When a man is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be charged with any business. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. But even if he has just got married, it should not prevent him from honouring a prior commitment. He's already accepted the invitation, and so he should honour it. So all of these excuses show that those who were invited considered other things, business or family commitments, to be more important than attendance at the banquet. The banquet was not their priority. So when the servant reported back to the householder, he became angry. Their refusal to come would have been taken as a great insult and would have brought shame on the householder who had invited them, that he's put on this great banquet and no one has come, and people would remember that and would perhaps make fun of him because of that. So those who had been invited then had dishonored the householder by declining the invitation. And this was important in that culture. It's an honor and shame culture that they live in at that time. But rather than cancel the whole event and lose face, he told his servant to go out again into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and maimed and lame and blind. These are the same groups who were mentioned in verse 13 when Jesus told the host of this meal that these were the people that he ought to invite. These would be the people out on the streets. They would also be the ones who were excluded from the assembly of God's people to participate in worship activities. So these are really the outcasts of society. And when the servant had done this, he reported to the householder that there was still space for even more guests, that the house hasn't been filled. And so the householder then told the servant to extend the search further and to go to the highways and the hedges and compel people to come in. He says that my house may be filled. The highways and the hedges outside of the city would be where those who were homeless and destitute would be found. And the servant was to compel these people to come to the banquet, to urge them to come, that he was not to take no for an answer. So the householder wanted his house to be filled with guests, but he said that none of those who had originally been invited shall taste my banquet. So there would be no second opportunity for those who had rejected the initial invitation with their excuses. And the banquet would go ahead with a full house, regardless of how those had responded initially. So the parable has been told in response to the comment made by one of the guests, who seemed to assume that he would be present at the banquet in the kingdom of God. Jesus' words show that not all those who are invited will necessarily be present. Entry will be by invitation only. But if people reject that invitation, then there will be no further opportunity to enter. God's invitation into his kingdom extends to all people, but it's only those who accept the invitation who will gain entry. The main point being taught in the parable is that no one can enter the kingdom without being invited by God, and no one can remain outside except by their own choice. The blessings of God's kingdom will be experienced through Christ, but only those who accept Christ will enjoy those blessings. The Jews, who perhaps assumed that they would be in the kingdom, then may find themselves outside if they reject Jesus as the Christ. Meanwhile, the kingdom will be open to others, to the tax collectors and the sinners, to the Gentiles, who will find entry if they accept Jesus as the Christ. The picture of the kingdom of God being like a banquet conveys to us the idea of a joyful occasion, a celebration which will characterize life in the kingdom of God. Jesus told a very similar parable to this on another occasion in Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. But the differences in the context and the details would indicate that these are two separate parables, not a variation of one parable. So a similar parable, but told on a different occasion. And the parable of Matthew chapter 22 was told by Jesus during his last week when he was teaching in the temple. And we'll read this one as well. This is Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 14. Jesus answered and spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of the heavens has become like a king who gave a wedding for his son, and he sent his slaves to call those invited to the wedding, and they did not want to come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those invited, look, I have prepared my midday meal, my ox and my fat calves have been killed, everything is ready, come to the wedding feast.' But they were unconcerned and went away, one to their field, another to their business. The rest grabbed the slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was furious and sent his soldiers to destroy those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited are not worthy. Go to the roads out of town, and whoever you find, invite them to the wedding.' Those slaves went out to the roads and gathered everyone that they found, the evil and the good, and the wedding was filled with those reclining at table. When the king came in, he looked at those reclining at table, and he saw someone who was not dressed in a wedding garment. He said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?' But he was flabbergasted. Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" So this parable concerns a marriage feast being given by a king for his son's wedding. In Luke's account, Luke's parable, we're not told that it was a wedding feast that people were being invited to, and we're not told that the person hosting it was a king. So here it's a king and his son is getting married. A royal wedding is an important occasion, and those invited should consider themselves highly honored. But like the parable in Luke, those invited make their excuses as to why they cannot come, and some here even mistreat and murder the servants who delivered the invitation. That's something that we don't have in Luke's parable. And their places are taken by those who are called in from the streets. And here in Matthew's account, Matthew's parable, the king then takes revenge on those who murdered his servants by sending troops to destroy them and their city. Again, that's not in Luke's account. And the parable concludes with the king's observation that one of the guests is not wearing a wedding garment, and consequently he's thrown out of the feast. The lesson from this may be that those who are brought in at the last minute to replace those originally invited should not assume that they have some sort of automatic right to be there. They too need to show honour to the king, in this case by dressing appropriately in a wedding garment, and not to think that they have the right to behave however they please, otherwise they too will be rejected. The immediate application of both Luke's and Matthew's versions of the parable would be to the Pharisees and the leaders, to those who were rejecting the invitation to come into the kingdom. The religious leaders might reject the invitation, but it is the outsiders, the tax collectors and the sinners who are accepting it, and they are the ones who are coming into the kingdom. More widely, we might apply it to the Jews' rejection of Jesus as the Messiah and the Gentiles' acceptance of him when the invitation is extended to them as well. So the parables that we've looked at this evening, the seats at the banquet and the invitation to the great banquet, the man who's not wearing the appropriate wedding garment, they show to us that entry into the kingdom is not something that we earn or that we deserve, not something that we are to take for granted, not something that we have some sort of automatic right to, but rather entry into the kingdom comes through the generosity and the graciousness of God, of the one who sends out the invitation. And our response to this is to be one of thankfulness, humble acceptance, and conformity to the standards of the kingdom.